Good evening. We're in Mark 9. We'll start in verse 42. Mark chapter 9, we'll start in verse 42. Mark 9, verse 42. Right before this paragraph, this is the last paragraph in chapter 9, and chapter 10 starts a whole new thought for sure. That's usually the case, not always the case. Sometimes the thought runs over into the next chapter, but chapter 9 ends and then chapter 10 begins a whole new thought. But the thing that has happened just before this is that the disciples were arguing over who's going to be the greatest in the kingdom, and Jesus has, as he has already had to do, begins to teach his disciples about their place, about the kingdom. He's going to teach them about what the kingdom is really like. And it's also true that during that time he's going to really bring up the thought about how his life is going to end. He'll be arrested. He'll be crucified, and after 3 days rise again. So you often have that placed in there as well. He ends it in verse 41 with kind of a one verse lesson. However, you have this little opportunity to teach, like this little small snippet where he says, for the one who is not against us is for us. Truly I say to you, anyone who gives a cup of cold water in my name will by no means lose his reward. So Jesus, being this master teacher and the one whom the disciples look up to, is now trying to teach them about what the kingdom is like, teach them about what they are to be and about who they are to be, and what they ought to be characterized by. He's talked to them about receiving the little children. That was after they were arguing about who's going to be the greatest. And then he also talks about giving a cup of cold water. The whole idea of being servants and being submissive to the cause of Christ and understanding their place in the kingdom, all of that is what's going on here in this latter part of chapter 9. So chapter 9 opens up with the warning against sin. I looked at this, and one of the things that came to me quickly was there's nothing worth losing your soul. Living in sin is not worth hell. That's really what he's talking about. So let's look at this. It's familiar to you if you've done any reading in the Gospels at all. So let's just read this, and as I read it, then we're going to come back and make some observations. But he opens up in verse 42 by referring to little ones. And remember, he also used that illustration back in chapter 9, verse 37. Whoever receives one of these, receives one such child in my name receives me. Whoever receives me receives not me, but him who sent me. And so the teaching about the kingdom seems to be still in play here in chapter 9. So chapter 9, verse 42, he's talking about the little ones. Whoever causes one of these little ones who believes in me to sin, it would be better for him if a great millstone were hung around his neck and he were thrown into the sea. And if your hand causes you to sin, cut it off. It is better for you to enter life crippled than with two hands to go to hell, to the unquenchable fire. And if your foot causes you to sin, cut it off. It is better for you to enter life lame than with 2 feet to be thrown into hell. And if your eye causes you to sin, tear it out. It is better for you to enter the kingdom of God with 1 eye than with 2 eyes to be thrown into hell, where their worm does not die and the fire is not quenched. For everyone will be salted with fire. Salt is good, but if the salt has lost its saltiness, how will you make it salty again? Have salt in yourselves and be at peace with one another. Now, there's a lot that's said there, but he uses this three-time illustration. This is not uncommon in Jesus' teaching. It's not uncommon in teaching, period, to use three examples. And so he does that. Actually, he begins by talking about if you cause a little one, if you harm a little one, or if you act wrongly toward someone, it would be better for you to have a millstone hung around your neck and be thrown into the sea. And then he says, if your hand causes you to sin, cut it off. If your foot causes you to sin, cut it off. If your eye causes you to sin, tear it out. And he responds to all of those by saying, it would be better for you to enter heaven, it'd be better for you to be in relationship with God with one hand, foot, eye than it would to enter hell with two hand, foot, eyes. So that's what he says there in those first several verses of this before he gets to verse 48. So, well, in verse 48, he's really describing the conditions of hell where the worm doesn't die and the fire is never quenched. So through verse 48. So what he's really saying there when you open it up in 43 through 48 is this battle that we have against sin. He opened it up, do not cause, there's no cause for sin. There's nothing that will justify sin. Sin should be avoided at all cost. And so that's what he really talks about in verses 42 through 48, is this battle against sin. Now, Jesus is not literally saying you need to cut off your hand or your foot or gouge out your eye. He's not saying that's something you literally need to do. He's giving example of how serious this matter is, the seriousness of sin, this battle against sin, and how important it is for the child of God, the one who's following Jesus, the one who's going to be a disciple of his. It is essential that the one who's going to be a disciple of Jesus, that one remain sinless or does not sin in that way. So you do whatever is needed to make sure that you do not sin, whatever that takes. You avoid it at all cost. What he's saying is that hell is not worth whatever you're going to pay for it. Hell is not worth whatever you're going to spend to buy hell. It's not worth that. And so he says, do whatever is necessary, whatever radical measure might be necessary to avoid sinning, so you do not inherit this place that is a burning fire, where the worm never dies, where there's this continual eternal punishment. Do whatever you need to do in order to avoid that place. So get rid of what needs to be gotten rid of. Avoid what needs to be avoided. Do whatever sacrificing needs to be done. Do what you need to do in order to avoid this sin that will cause you to be separated from God for an eternity. Because that is what Jesus is really talking about here. He's talking about disciples, talking to his disciples, talking to those who should be an example, and he's telling them that there is nothing worth going to hell over. Avoid it, get rid of it, do whatever is necessary, and this is a very strong picture that Jesus paints about how significant or how important it is that we avoid sin at all costs, whatever it takes. Because you notice in verses, look at verse 43. If your hand causes you sin, cut it off. It is better for you to enter life crippled than with two hands to go to hell, to the unquenchable fire. 45, he says, than to be thrown into hell. And then verse 47, it's better than being thrown into hell. And then he describes it in verse 48, where the worm does not die and fire is not quenched. So he uses all of these illustrations to describe the battle against sin and to make those radical choices that have to be made in order to avoid sin, so we're not heading in that place that he describes there as hell, and he describes it pretty well. So observations, anything you'd like to bring out, or maybe observations about the text? What was standing between the disciples and making those radical choices Jesus is talking about here? What was standing between the disciples and making this choice? Why did he have to do this teaching here? What stands between us and us making that choice?
Lack of knowledge.
It could be lack of knowledge. Yeah, sometimes that's it.
Think about earthly power.
Okay. Their thoughts, remember what Jesus got on to Peter about? Your mind is on the earthly and not on the spiritual. And what they were just thinking about and just what's on their mind was who's going to be the greatest. So where's their mind? On an earthly possession, on an earthly status. So that's what's on their mind. So Mari brings out the fact that our minds can be on the earthly more than it is on the heavenly or the spiritual, causing us to be unwilling to make the choice, that radical choice to avoid sin. Say it again. Lack of faith. Certainly the disciples had that lack of faith. So it's almost as if you've got to make this. See, the very choice that they made to follow Jesus was a faith choice. It's not like it was blind faith, really. We've talked a little bit about in the past when we read through Mark where Jesus chose his disciples. There was some knowledge about Jesus, evidently. They understood some about him, but they still, even after having been with him for years now, they still don't grasp it. So yes, they certainly had a lack of faith, which would cause them not to be willing to radically change and do whatever needed to be done to avoid sin. What else stands between us or stands between the disciples here and making that choice to be radical in our avoidance of sin?
I think a lot of people, it's hard for them to wrap around the fact that there is a hell.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people, it's just like, it just can't be a place like that.
Mm-hmm.
God wouldn't do that.
Yeah, I think for some people, it is hard to wrap our brain around something that is as awful and terrible as hell. I understand it never was created for people. The description that is given is that it was created for the devil and his angels. But there you go. Those that disobey God, refuse to be radical in their avoidance of sin, he says that's where you'll wind up. That's kind of difficult for us to grasp. The devil's a disciple, yes. If you refuse to stop sinning, you are the devil's disciple, yes. All right, look at 48, we looked at 48, 49 and 50. When you look at 49 and 50, Jesus is talking about the test to see if you've actually done that, if you've actually pushed away the temptation and allowed yourself to be firm and strong in resisting sin and not allowing yourself to be overwhelmed by it or to accept it or to receive it into your life and into your heart. He says in verse 49 and 50, "For everyone will be salted with fire. Salt is good, but if the salt has lost its saltiness, how will you make it salty again? Have salt in yourselves and be at peace with one another." he uses salt there in a lot of different ways and in a lot of different contexts. There is in the Old Testament there are several uses of salt in the Old Testament. As a matter of fact, there is, I think, in Numbers 18, it has some reference to the idea of the covenant relationship. There is a reference to it in that way. And so in the context of these opportunities to keep from sinning, Jesus says to his disciples to be seasoned with salt so that you can become that sacrifice to me. Be seasoned with salt so that you can be in that covenant relationship with me, so you can be dedicated to me. He could have just as easily talked about the idea of being ceremonially clean or being cleansed by washing. He could have used that. I think that would have been the same meaning. So what he's talking about is being an appropriate sacrifice, being tested, being put to the test, going through the struggle and the temptation of sin. And when you get through that, you've come out clean. You've come out without having given in to the tricks and the wiles and the temptation of the devil. And so you come out as having sacrificed yourself to God. From that perspective, salt is used. But he also uses it in a similar way as to what he uses in Matthew 5, which is the idea of your influence and how salt influences everything that it comes in contact with. So it used in the right way, it influences for good. It influences, we've talked about it in a lot of different ways, how it preserves, it influences a lot of things that it does. But what he's talking about at the end there is make sure that you have become that person who has given themselves to God as a sacrifice, so that you avoid the sin that will break that relationship with God. So be salty and be the one who will be an influence in the world as well. So, any observations there on verses 49 and 50?
Salt was sort of essential to their well-being.
Yes.
Like you said, it was a preservative, it made their food taste better.
Mm-hmm.
It was very much a part of their lives. And then he's using that as an example to say, you're supposed to be part of that also.
Yeah. Yeah, I think from the example of the Old Testament, the way that it was used in a sacrifice, I think he's referencing there, be that sacrifice yourselves, give yourself to me as a sacrifice. I think it's exactly what Romans 12, 1 and 2, give your bodies a living sacrifice. I think that's what he's saying there. Give yourselves as a sacrifice. And then in the end, he's saying, you be an influence in the world and live with peace with one another. Isn't that interesting? He kind of uses salt in a couple of different ways. At the end, he says, be salt in the world and live with peace with one another. Quite an interesting way that he kind of wraps up this section of chapter 9, 42 and following.
They are, when I think in the benefits they talk about the grain offering and salt it before that. If you don't salt it, it's going to decay.
Mm-hmm.
So you want to preserve it, keep it like it is, or go along, and then salt helps to keep it that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good observation. So he says, avoid hell at all costs. Isn't that what he's saying? Whatever it costs you, whatever it means to you, whatever it means for you, you do whatever you have to do to avoid hell. That's what he says. I don't want you literally plucking your eye out. That's not what he means. What he's saying is, be aggressive in purging sin from your life and avoiding sin, or else the result is hell. So avoid hell at all costs. Hell is just not worth it. What's the old, I've heard preachers use this, or maybe I've read it before, but is the cost of living in hell for eternity worth 15 minutes of pleasure? Some people trade 15 minutes of pleasure for an eternity of hell. And that's what he's talking about here. Don't let it keep you from being in relationship with God. Don't let one thing, don't let these things, you be radical in getting those out of your life.
Too long ago, again, in the 40s, my daddy had a store. And it's that rural, and most of the people were farmers and so on. The main thing they ordered was coffee, flour. It wasn't a sack flour, it was barrel flour back then. They wanted coffee, flour, and salt, and sugar.
Mm-hmm.
That's the main thing. And the rest of it they grew or preserved.
Right. That's a good observation. The pioneers, he didn't go all the way back to the pioneers, but they were almost pioneers. Your settlers, those who were homesteaders, they needed those things to sustain life. They grew most of them, but they couldn't grow coffee, and they could have done the flour, and there were some mills around, but the sugar and salt coffee was a staple for sure. All right, let's look at chapter 10 then. Chapter 10. And remember, one of the things that is a theme throughout Mark's gospel, it's not just a theme through Mark's gospel, but it keeps showing up in Mark's gospel, and that is when something happens, when there's a miracle, when people seem to be amazed or when people seem to be astonished and things are going well and people are turning to Jesus and disciples are following him, the thing that seems to always show up is the conflict with the religious leaders of the day, the conflict with the Jews. So that's what happens in chapter 10 in this teaching about divorce, because in chapter 10 it says he left there and went to the region of Judea and beyond the Jordan, and crowds gathered to him again and again, as was his custom. He taught them. So you have verse 1 of chapter 10 paints this picture of Jesus being very popular. Jesus is in the region of Judea beyond the Jordan. Crowds are gathering around him, and he taught them. And, by the way, Mark adds to that, it was his custom to teach them. That's what he's been doing all along. Crowds would gather, he would teach. Crowds would gather, he would teach. And remember, early in the Gospel of Mark, he's doing all of this healing, and people are being brought to him to heal. And finally, he says to the disciples, we've got to get out of here. We've got to move away from this crowd, and I need to go back to doing what I came to do, which is teach. Yeah. So he came to teach. So that was his custom. That's what he did. The miracles had a purpose. There was a reason behind it all. And one of the things that it did was to prove that he was the Son of God, that he was the Messiah that had been predicted from the Old Testament scriptures. And so what happens in chapter 10 verse 1 is this foundation has been painted where Jesus has multitudes of followers now around him, and he is teaching them. So what do you expect is going to happen in verse 2? If you read ahead, you know. What's going to happen? Conflict. Yeah, conflict. That's going to happen again. So it often comes in this, under this guise. And the Pharisees came up to him and asked him a question. But what was their motive? Was their motive to find the answer to the question? What was their motive? The ESV says they asked him a question, came up, and in order to test him, what John says, they wanted to catch him in something. They wanted to catch him teaching something that was against their law, or something that was against their custom, or something, if they could catch him teaching something against the law of Moses, or whatever they could catch him in, they just wanted to catch him, because you realize that he's doing all of this in spite of the fact that they've already decided that he has to die. Remember that? They'd already decided that. That's happened a long time ago. They already decided he's going to die. So he's doing this right in front of under their noses, right in front of everybody. And so the Pharisees come to him, and in order to test him, they ask him this question that was it was one of those questions that they bantered around, they bantered back and forth, and one of those things that would have been, you would ask your rabbi. If you're following a rabbi, you would ask your rabbi, what do you believe to be the teaching? What do you believe to be this teaching? Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife? What do you believe about that? What does the Torah teach about that? And so they're going to go through that. So that's the question they asked Jesus. It's one of those questions that's been bantered back and forth among the Jews, and so now they're going to try to catch him answering it either one way or the other way, or they're going to catch him in some way betraying himself or betraying Moses. So that's why they asked the question. So the question is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife? Verse 3, Jesus answered them, what did Moses command you?
Is it lawful? So they were using it as a legal thing rather than a spiritual thing.
Yeah, you may be right. Exactly. That phrase may be what they're trying to throw at him there, rather than trying to answer it from the spiritual. Yes. So he answered, what did Moses command you? They said, Moses allowed a man to write a certificate of divorce and to send her away. Now that's, I think, Numbers, let's see, I jotted it down somewhere. Deuteronomy, yeah, it's Deuteronomy 24, Deuteronomy 24, yeah. So Deuteronomy 24:1 and following is where Moses there is telling them about writing a bill of divorcement to a wife. That wife goes and marries somebody else, and then he dies. The first husband can't legally marry that wife. That was the context of Deuteronomy 24. A little hard to understand and grasp, but that seems to be the gist of what's going on there. So they say Moses allowed for a writ of divorce, for you to write a certificate and divorce, put your wife away. And then Jesus answers, verse 5, because of your hardness of heart, he wrote you this commandment, but from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. All right, let's stop right there, because the significant phrase is the first phrase in Jesus' answer, because he says, because of your hardness of heart, he wrote you this commandment. Because of the hardness of your heart. So what it seems that Jesus is replying is, yes, Moses was writing about a writ of divorcement or a certificate or signing that. And by the way, it's Deuteronomy 24 talks about indecent. Yeah, thank you for that. I was going to turn back there and look for the word. If she had behaved in an indecent way, okay, so what does that imply? What does that mean? I'm not sure. I don't know. I don't know what exactly that means. We go back and look at that. But so what Jesus is saying, it seems, is that was never God's intention to allow for divorce or to have divorce as a part of this plan, because he opens up the conversation or his answer by saying, because of your hardness of heart, he wrote you this commandment. So why would Moses allow it? Why did Moses speak of it in that way? It's not like Moses writes and says it's okay to write that certificate of divorcement. He's just saying, in Deuteronomy 24, he's saying, when a man writes this writ of divorcement. So I think what he means when he opens that up, he says that it was never intended for it to be that way. That's not the way God wanted it, because what happens next, to me, explains what Jesus says there. Because Jesus then goes on to explain creation and man and woman and one man for one woman and leaving and cleaving and two shall be one flesh. What God has joined together, let not man put asunder. So in that whole context, we'll read it in just a moment. In that whole context, I think he's saying that God never wanted it that way. That's not the way God wanted it. He never intended for man and woman to separate. Because here's what he says. But from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. Therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they're no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let not man separate. Okay, that's the end of his answering the Pharisees' question. He's going to add to that when the disciples ask him again about this matter. He's going to add more to this, but let's stop right there, because what does he answer the Pharisees? Or let me ask it this way. Does he answer the Pharisees' question? He did, yeah. So how does he answer the question? Yeah, so what's their question? Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife? What does Jesus say? No. No. Yeah. That's the end of his interaction with them, right? So he says no. Now, when we get down here, he's going to talk about committing adultery. He's going to explain that. But in his answer to the Pharisees, he ended it right there by saying, no, here's what God wants. Here's what God wants.
You get married, when a husband and wife, when they get married, then it's a permanent thing. All right, if they separate or divorce, they can't marry another one unless it's adultery. Well, when you go back to Deuteronomy, it concerns divorce. If they divorce their wife, then somebody else marries that way. Then they can't remarry that way. Mm-hmm. So I think what it means as far as today, you need to think about before you marry. That's permanent. That's permanent. Mm-hmm. Well, back then, you better think about it before you divorce somebody. Not for a previous thing, because you can't remarry that person after you divorce.
Yeah, right. Yeah, good observation. The explanation that he gives is straight to the point, and it is straight from creation because he says, but from the beginning of creation, and here's the way God planned it, here's the way God wanted it, male and female becoming one flesh. And as Maury points out, when you get to the other part of the divorce, and there's this separating and no longer being, well, it creates quite a lot of havoc and difficulty. So it's obviously something that needs to be thought about in with great pain.
What Ronnie's saying though is, if you divorce your wife, and then she remarries, and that man divorces her, whatever, or he dies.
Yeah.
The reason you cannot remarry her is because she's been defiled.
Mm-hmm.
But if she has never remarried, and you have not, I think you've got the right to remarry.
Yes.
Because there's been no defiling.
Exactly.
It's not saying you can never remarry her.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Right.
maybe you divorce and
That's what I really want you to do is think about it before you just in a previous way divorce somebody.
Right. Yeah, and maybe this is where we have not done enough teaching on this part, because Jesus' explanation of why is pretty clear. There's the marriage, God joins you together, and those two become one flesh. It's not just a sexual relationship. It's not just that you live in the same house. It is more than any of that. It is becoming one flesh because you become one in God, and that from that perspective. And to undo that, to break that, then is where Jesus answers that question with, no, God never wanted it that way. No, it's not lawful. It's not right. It's not good. But then Matthew adds the same thing that we read here with some different wording. But then the disciples asked Jesus about this matter further. And he said, whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against her. And if she divorces her husband and marries another, she commits adultery. Matthew adds, except it be for fornication, I believe. Divorces his wife, except it be for fornication. So you put all of that together, and you really come down to there should be no divorcement except for the cause of fornication, and then there should be no marrying of one who's divorced unless there is in that unfaithfulness in that relationship. So there you have 10:1 through 12, and that's Jesus answering this test. The test is, what do you believe about a man divorcing his wife? Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife? And he asks, what does Moses say? And they say Moses allowed it. And Jesus then begins to tell them why God didn't allow it, why God said no, God didn't want it. And then the disciples ask further questions, and he gives some more detail. Our time's up. I know you've got probably more thoughts or questions or observations about that, but we'll pick up there next week. Appreciate your comments.